Finally, we should look a little bit at the soldiering experience and the ways in which it has been represented, particularly in literature. The cultural historian Paul Fussell distinguishes three different narrative modes in the literary representation of war. He does this by borrowing from the cultural theorist Northrop Frye. He talks about three different modes, and there could be broadly periodized if you want. Certainly there's a kind of there is a kind of chronology to the ways in which these narrative modes have developed, even if there is overlap and that they can persist beyond particular periods. But the three categories are the following. The first is an epic register. In an epic story, in an epic narration, what we see typically is that the main protagonist has a freedom of action that is greater than our own. This is what we associate with kind of mythical, epic narratives, where characters may be gods or godlike or heroic, and they possess powers greater than our own. Their purchase on the world is much in excess of the one we would recognize for ourselves. A second register is the realistic register, where a protagonist's freedom of action is pretty much similar to ours. And this is quite typical of the 19th century novel, which was trying to explore the psychology of and the social in contexts of individuals, and present their actions in a realistic fashion, in a way that we might associate with our own situations and our own positionality in the world. And finally, there's an ironic register, in which protagonists' freedom of action is typically less than ours. These characters tend to exist in grotesque, absurd worlds, where the world is set against them, where wherever they turn, they are generally frustrated or unable to act upon it. This is reflected in the writings of a Kafka, the theatre of, or the works of a Joyce, or the theatre of a Thomas Becket. Now, the argument of Fussell is that the literature of the First World War is on the knife edge between the realistic and ironic modes. That, in other words, we start to see emerging in that literature a tendency towards irony, in an experience or a representation of the experience of the war that presents war as something that overwhelms the participants within it, in which their agency is considerably reduced, often to the point of absurdity. So in that ironic register, in the war literature, we see very much a contrast between expectation and reality, intention and outcome. Soldiers enter into war with certain ideas of what war will be like, and the reality is something quite other. Very often the randomness, the contingency of war is brought to the fore. And of course, this resonates perhaps with the reality of what industrialized war had become. We've explored this idea previously with the idea of the warrior, the ways in which great bravery, courage, warrior skill becomes less significant in a world in a war dominated by the machines, where at any moment a shell might fall from the sky and blow you up, and where your survival maybe have little to do with your merit and just with simple chance. The ironic literature on war also tends to emphasize contradiction and ambiguity, to present war as something that's both fascinating and horrifying, inhumane, but also the opportunity for noble actions and human spirit, something that constitutes both the worst and the greatest moments in the lives of its protagonists. And all of this, I think, can be seen as a search for a language to describe what must have been the quite undescribable or indescribable event of the First World War. This modern industrial war with large-scale conscription meant that the experience of war affected more individuals, which often had to reintegrate society with great difficulties at communicating their experience with those who had not been at war. As the British war poet Siegfried Sassoon puts it, the man who really endured the war at its worst was everlastingly differentiated from everyone except his fellow soldiers. this idea of distance, alienation from the rest of society is given a very interesting fictional treatment in a work by Joe Haldeman, a Vietnam veteran, in a science fiction book called The Forever War. The premise of The Forever War is that in conflicts of the future, the human species is fighting distant alien enemies, has to travel great distances as a consequence of it, travels close to the speed of light thanks to available technology. But due to the laws of relativity, it means that soldiers who are sent to fight in this war may go for a tour of several months, but by the time they come back to Earth, Earth time has moved on faster than they have, so they come back to a society that is 7 or 8 or 9, 10 years in the future, and what they encounter is a radically changed society, or a society that's moved on and in which they can no longer recognize themselves. And as a consequence, the protagonist in The Forever War decides to go for further tours, every time coming back and being more alienated from the society he encounters. And here I think Haldeman was trying to give some fictional account of what must have been an experience for perhaps him and for other Vietnam veterans who went to war in Vietnam in the 1960s at the moment of great social change in the US, and came back to a society that they perhaps didn't recognize anymore, often to sometimes hostile American public, certainly one that could not really understand what they were going through. It is certainly true that veterans will often speak about how it is really impossible to communicate to people who have not experienced war what that's like, and that accordingly there is a real community of veterans, people who have shared that experience, even when that experience is across enemy lines. Now, some individuals came out of the First World War feeling shattered and broken by the experience, profoundly traumatized. Others came back with a more enthralled view that they had traversed a heightened state of existence. Henry Williamson, another poet of the First World War, explains that those who passed through the estranging remoteness of battle were not broken but reborn. And I think we have to understand that experience of war as well, in particularly as it came to inform the political ideologies of the post-war period. So whether it's fascism or communism, both of these movements were irrigated by the veteran experience. Many veterans came back from the front and found civilian life to be drab and uninspiring. There were limited economic opportunities and perhaps none of the camaraderie that they had experienced in the trenches. One could quite conceive how the experience of the trenches would then draw people to political movements that promise some kind of fusional collective, whether again communist or fascist. It's also probably the case that the experience of violence at the front led to an inclination towards a particular kind of ruthlessness in politics, the kind of niceties of liberal communication and debate, and so may have seemed quite irrelevant to individuals who'd seen such suffering and death on the battlefront. The 1920s and so forth are also a period in where we see an artistic avant-garde very much promoted, challenging radically kind of ideas of what would count as art and how society should be represented. And we shouldn't lose from sight that the very term of avant-garde is itself a military term, of an advanced military detachment that is supposed to scout advancing terrain ahead of a main body of fighting men. So after the First World War, despite the trauma, we still see very distinctively a number of individuals that want to see the First World War and war as an experience that should be carried through enthusiastically into civilian society. But after the Second World War, such continued enthusiasm for war becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. And throughout the second half of the 20th century, it's very much the ironic literature on war that dominates, emphasizing the meaninglessness, the absurdity of the experience of war. In most of this literature, we see no real existential value or heroism in war. The protagonists who are immersed in these novels have as their only aim to survive. In fact, many of these classic works of literature say very little about combat itself. They focus very much on the expectation, on the waiting of conflict, rather than on battle itself. So let us look at a few of these works. A couple of works written by World War II veterans. Joseph Heller's famous Catch-22, published in 1961, based on Heller's experience operating on US bombers in Italy during the Second World War. And in the novel, Heller describes this so-called Catch-22. The Catch-22 is a bureaucratic disposition which says, well, obviously, in order to fly bombing missions, you need to be sane of mind. But if you were to declare yourself insane, then it would probably mean that you are sane, because it is a perfectly sane thing to do to wish to avoid bombing missions, and therefore it's entirely sane to claim insanity to avoid flying. And so if you claim insanity, it must be that you are sane. In other words, you must fly either way. And what was supposed to be embedded in this kind of Catch-22 idea is a bureaucratic absurdity. The fact that the war is a bigger machine than any individual, that you are conscripted in it whether you like it or not, that the war is guided by some kind of bureaucratic absurdity that is apparently detached from any greater purpose. So in the novel, there's no sense of a great noble conflict. There's just the experience of a few individuals trying to survive an experience that seems determined to kill them. Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five also is based on the author's experience of the war, and particularly Vonnegut experienced or was in the city of Dresden in Germany as a US soldier, a prisoner of war, I believe, when Dresden was bombed. And of course, Dresden was the site of one of the most violent fire bombings of the entire war. And the central character of Slaughterhouse-Five goes through very much that experience and is haunted by it as a consequence. And many years after the war, he has, in some sense, is still unstuck in time. He finds himself traveling back to this past, traveling to other worlds to meet alien beings. He's profoundly disassociated by this fundamental trauma of war. And in the novel, Vonnegut, or his character, reflects on the idea that stopping war is akin to stopping an iceberg. In other words, it can't be done. You're just a single individual facing a monumental force, and the only thing you can do is try not to be entirely crushed by it. A few more novels produced on the basis of the experience in later conflicts. So I've already talked about The Forever War by Joel Haldeman, published in 1974, based on Haldeman's Vietnam War experience. So let me talk briefly about a couple more novels, these ones based on the experience of the Gulf War, 1991. The first, by James Blinn, The Aardvark is Ready for War, tells the story of a soldier in an anti-submarine unit, and he was sent to prepare for war against Iraq. But of course the catch here is that the enemy has no submarines. So what we get in the novel is a kind of postmodern malaise where the character, the central protagonist, experiences war as entirely mediated and distanciated through technology. He has to perform these simulations of anti-submarine warfare, and there is this kind of this uncertainty about what the real and what the simulation is. This is very much an account of the soldier technician, again taken to absurd ends. And finally, Anthony Swofford's Jarhead tells the story of a Marine Corps sniper, Swofford himself really, who was prepared all his life to fight in a war. He came from a family of soldiers and goes to Iraq in the expectation that he's going to realize his destiny, he's going to kill, and yet he goes through the entire Gulf War without ever discharging his weapon. The war is over within, the ground war is over within a few days. The war was largely won through aerial bombing, and so he is the frustrated soldier. He never gets to achieve what he wanted. The war is completely devoid of meaning or the purpose that he thought he was going to find in it. So as you can see, what's recurrent within all these works is the theme of the meaninglessness of war and the lack of purpose for the characters that find themselves caught up in it. And this is a tendency we can also see in war films since Vietnam. So whereas the kind of ironic turn in literature can be traced back to the First World War, it's perhaps not until the Vietnam War that we see a similar turn in cinematography. And we'll get to talk about films in a week's time. But what we see from the Vietnam War onwards is a treatment of war as also increasingly ironic and absurd. Perhaps it is, in fact, today, if we wanted to think about an art form in which the heroic mode persists in the representations of war, we would have to look at video games. For after all, typically video games present us with characters that very much possess more agency in the world than we do. In some sense, they are immortal because you can die and restart as many times as you want. You are generally equipped with weapons or powers or skills that are far in excess of what any mere mortal would expect. So it may be that that's where the heroic mode or representation of war finds itself today in the realm of the video game, your Call of Duties and so forth. In conclusion, I think one of the important things to draw from this session is that the meanings ascribed to collective histories and personal experiences of war is never settled. It remains open to challenge, to unforeseen modes of reception. And it's important to be mindful that there's always a politics of memory at work, one through which human collectives determine the ways in which they understand themselves, the significations they give to their bonds, and the orientations they take in relation to their imagined future.